Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me today here at the CarbonExpo. Real excited to be back. Year two of this event. It's a great event put on by Dwayne and his team. Really appreciate them asking me to come back this year and provide another update around the certified natural gas movement. Talk a little bit about why, what it is, what's driving it. If you don't know me, my name is Andrew Parker. I am the Executive Vice President of Hydrocarbons and Sustainability at a company called SPL. If you don't know who we are as a company, we're probably one of the largest oil and gas service companies that you've maybe never heard of before. And so we have a pretty big footprint here in the United States, and as well as some international locations in Australia and London. But we're an energy tech company, so we specialize in testing, inspection, and certification services for the energy industry, primarily oil and gas, but certainly looking at emerging energies as well. We have a network of laboratories throughout the United States that perform all kinds of compositional, physical property, experimental testing of various hydrocarbon products from the wellhead to downstream finished products. Everything from natural gas to lubricants, gasoline, diesel fuels, etc. So chances are there's an SPL lab close by that can help you out with any needs you have in that space. We take a lot of pride in our staff. We have almost 600 employees now. We have a field of 200 plus technicians, about 115 lab technicians in the labs. We serve on various technical committees, and so yeah, give us a call if you have any needs in that space. Okay, so I'm going to start off this talk with what I think a current event that I think kind of sets the stage for why we really are interested in trying to produce natural gas with as low of an emissions profile as possible. And so back during President Biden's State of the Union, one of the headlines that came out of that was that he admitted oil and gas is going to be required for a considerable amount of time. I think he said about 10 years, but we all probably know that 10 years is an understatement. But it was an open admission to the role that oil and gas will continue to play when it comes to providing safe, reliable, cost-effective power, not just in the United States, but across the world. And this graphic kind of circulated, kind of made the rounds, so to speak. And I think it's pretty interesting, right? So it's from the Energy Information Administration. And what it shows is basically what the energy outlook is, and where we're going to get our electricity between now and 2050. And a couple interesting trends, I think, to note on this. The first that jumped out to me was nuclear, and I hope that nuclear profile changes in the years to come. But that is a disturbing flatline for nuclear power generation. But what also you pick out here is there's a really big increase in the amount of electricity that's going to be delivered by renewables. But you don't see a corresponding decrease in hydrocarbon fuels. So coal is going to go down a little bit, and but natural gas continues an upward trajectory. That's because we're not, as we decommission some coal plants, you still have to replace that energy. But there's also going to be an increase in demand from growing populations and industrialization of growing countries like India and China and so on. And so while renewables are going to certainly have their day and come to the forefront in terms of how much they electricity they provide, hydrocarbon fuels are not going away, natural gas in particular. And so this whole, I think, narrative that we hear about, we got to electrify everything, is really meaningless if we don't have a way to create that electricity cleanly. And so electrification doesn't necessarily solve the decarbonization question. And when we look at our emissions profile in the United States, about 1/3 of our CO2 emissions come from generating electricity. Another 35% comes from driving cars and flying on airplanes and buses and transportation. And then various other contributions from your homes, manufacturing, industrial processes, etc. And so there's a lot of focus right now on, hey, we gotta try to put EVs on the road and get combustion engines out of our economy, and that's good. That makes sense. But if you're relying on electricity to charge those vehicles, you got to produce that electricity cleanly, or else you're not making as big of an impact as you think. Right. And so in the United States, a lot of the conversation today comes around the coal and natural gas electricity and what's generated from those fuels. So today, about 20% of our electricity in the US comes from renewables. About 20% comes from nuclear. So 40% of that electricity generation is actually what you would call clean. It doesn't have a CO2 byproduct. But the other 60% comes from coal and natural gas primarily. And that's the part that we're having a lot of conversations with today. In particular, we want to phase out coal. And we don't want coal to be the primary source of generating electricity as it's been for decades. And so kind of a common conversation you hear is the potential for natural gas to be a potential alternative to coal. And the reason that is because natural gas, when you burn it, it emits about half the CO2 per million BTUs generated than coal. So if you overnight change from coal to natural gas, you automatically cut your CO2 emissions in half. So that's something that we can do and have a tangible impact on reducing emissions today. The problem is that proponents of that narrative point out that number does not include the associated methane that is released by leaks and other processes during the production and gathering process of that natural gas. And so when we look at methane in particular, we see that about 30% of the methane emitted to the atmosphere today comes from the production of natural gas and fossil fuels. The reason that methane is all of a sudden become a much more talked about greenhouse gas over CO2 is that methane is a much stronger greenhouse gas. It has a much higher CO2 equivalent. So for every ton of methane emitted to the atmosphere initially, that's 100 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than 1 ton of CO2, 100 times stronger than CO2 when emitted. But it also stays in the atmosphere for a much shorter period of time. And so methane is oxidized and it's converted into CO2. And so if you kind of think back to the 70s and 80s when there was concern about CFCs putting a hole in the ozone layer around Antarctica, and the world came together to ban these products, and now the ozone hole is healing. Methane, I think, has kind of a similar potential to where not only can we reduce methane emissions, but or all but eliminate them. But then long term, within our lifetime, we can actually see that methane concentration in the atmosphere start to go backwards and reduce as more of it is oxidized out of the air. And so, this conversation of, well, how do we produce electricity cleanly? We know that we're going to need fossil fuels for a long period of time. We know that natural gas can be a low carbon alternative to something like coal and some liquid petroleum fuels, but we have this methane problem. And so that's really driven these certified natural gas programs that perhaps you've heard some about. And so a lot of people started talking about how can we be more aware and more diligent at reducing leaks and reducing methane from the oil and gas production and gathering process, so that it has a extremely limited our leak rates are extremely limited and reduced, and we can say with confidence that the natural gas we're using to burn to make electricity truly is 50% less CO2 than coal. And so these different terms have popped up, and different programs have popped up in the last call it 3-4 years. It's a relatively new, I think, industry within oil and gas, and you've probably heard it a few different ways. There's responsibly sourced natural gas. Maybe you've heard of certified natural gas. Maybe you've heard of differentiated natural gas. And the terms seem to be a little bit intertwined these days, I think, and we'll talk a little bit about it here in a few slides about, responsibly sourced gas. I think nowadays is typically associated with one certifier in particular. I think certified natural gas tends to be a broader term, an umbrella term that describes any natural gas that has been produced according to a very strict set of environmental standards and has had third-party review as part of it. I think differentiated natural gas is similar, but hasn't necessarily had the extensive review and third-party review that certified natural gas may have gone through. But it's one of those things that if you ask anyone, they probably have a different definition for each term, and so it is a little bit confusing in that sense. So that's why in this talk I'm kind of calling it low carbon or low emission natural gas, to try to create some degree of consistency around the programs we're referring to. So these programs and these initiatives that are being introduced really have a few key elements that have to be followed. Obviously, they're methane centric. Okay, so primarily the point here is not so worried about CO2 emissions necessarily, but the emphasis is on methane and methane intensity, which is basically how much are you leaking relative to how much are you producing, right? And then you get a ratio, and that is your methane intensity. Measurement is really, I think, paramount to these programs. Measurement is a part of all of these certification platforms where whether you're looking to deploy measurement across an entire field or a subset of assets, you have to be able to measure the methane effectively. And we'll get into measurement here shortly. Reporting. Obviously, the best case scenario for the operator is that the measurements and the data you're collecting are working in tandem with regulatory requirements and other disclosures that are mandated today. But also that data is accumulated in such a way that it's shareable and it's accessible, and it's not necessarily something that companies want to keep for private. And then the last is the verification piece. Most of these certification programs, or low carbon, low natural gas production programs are verifiable. There's some element of third party audit that happens, where, okay, you've got your processes set up, you're looking at your assets, you're trying to figure out, you're looking at your facility designs, and you're identifying environmental practices and measurement strategies and detection strategies and so forth to mitigate as much of the methane in your production as possible. But you're also going to open up the book and share those plans and potentially even share the data with a third party that's going to review and critique and ensure that there is transparency in that process. Really, this piece is, I think, really important because it gives outsiders the confidence that you're not greenwashing. Right? If you're doing it by yourself without a whole lot of willingness to share what you're doing, I think some people, certainly the skeptics of our industry, will cry greenwashing. And so the verification piece is very important in terms of transparency and driving belief in what you're actually doing as an organization. Okay, so I broke these down into frameworks and certification programs. So programs like Veritas that just came out, the One Future Initiative, and then at the top, that set of logos encompasses the OGMP 2.0 framework, where these frameworks are basically a broader set of methods that really can work in tandem. They can be stackable with certification programs, but they really provide that framework for companies to help standardize at mostly an international level what you're doing as a producer or an operator to reduce your emissions across the board in a manner in which everyone is doing it. So the OGMP 2.0 framework is done. That's done through the UN. So that's the United Nations program, whereas the others are more industry driven. But when it comes to you're sitting at your company and you're wanting to do one of these programs, but you're not sure, do I do a framework? Do I do a certification? What do I do? These frameworks, again, tend to be broader. They're less prescriptive. They allow you to be able to choose your own destiny, so to speak, on a number of fronts, relative to a certification program that might be a little more prescriptive. But there's a number of questions that you at your organization can ask around, do I want to put forth the time and effort and the capital pursuing one of these methane reduction framework and certification programs? And the first really is what commitment to measurement is your organization willing to take? Some of these programs require very extensive measurement strategies that would require a lot of capital, right? When it comes to continuous, do I have to have fixed, some of these new emerging technologies that are continuous and fixed on a location, and they're constantly watching the emissions on my pad? Can I use flyovers? Can I use drones? What commitment to measurement you're willing to take might influence which program ultimately you wish to follow. Uh, Domestic or international? Are you an international producer? Does the international visibility matter? Does it not? That's another question that's going to drive. Um, how much do the S and G matter? So by S and G, I mean how much, in the ES and G movement does the S and G matter? Um, some of the certification frameworks, in particular, have an additional emphasis on the social and governance pieces, whereas others really are focused primarily on the E and the methane and the emissions piece. So how much the S&G matters might persuade you one way or another. Are you willing to open your books? What level of auditing and review are you willing to go through and pay for with these programs? Again, some can be more invasive than others, and so you'll want to do your homework around how much you want to open up yourself to that process. And then credits and tradable tokens, are those a goal? Are you doing this for to reduce methane across the board? Are you doing this because you think you can make a return on investment? If you're looking to capture carbon credits for your efforts, if you're looking to tackle, obtain tradable tokens, then you're probably going to want to go with a certification program, because frameworks like the Veritas and the OGMP 2.0 don't typically offer a tradable component as part of the program, whereas the certification programs do. So Project Canary, MIQ, Equitable Origins, these are more of the mainstream certification programs. There's also methane performance credits, which is a expansive and Valideer initiative that you can also explore. But these offer that additional step where you can start to tokenize the methane reduction efforts and take the data and actually turn it into a fungible token that you can use to sell and various other applications. So, I was talking last slide about the S and the G. How much does that matter? So the Project Canary, they've been around. They're one of the originals, one of the OGs in this space, and they really coined that term, the responsibly sourced gas, responsible gas. Part of the Canary review, as well as the EO review, there is a very extensive, I think, S&G component to it, more so probably on the EO side, but certainly Canary also has a component of S&G review. It's more of a holistic review that looks at all aspects of your company, including production, but also some of those other factors. MIQ tends to be more of a straight methane focused certification body, but nevertheless, these certification programs can be stackable with frameworks. They're a little more prescriptive. They're a little more invasive in terms of third-party review and auditing and the transparency and involvement with other bodies that you have to go through to obtain them. I think you could probably make an argument they're a little bit more expensive because of those reasons, but they're very mainstream programs that are out there now that many producers have adopted and are looking at to help them reduce methane emissions and earn some money off of it. So when we think about earning money, and we think about what's driving demand for this low emission natural gas, there's a few things. I think supply and demand, specifically in Europe, right? So we think about the geopolitical tensions going on in the European Union right now, and their reliance on countries like Russia for natural gas and the crisis that they found themselves in with the war. U.S. cargoes of LNG continue to go up and overseas, and they are hungry for natural gas that has been produced responsibly. They have a cap and trade system that recently, I think, some countries have even kind of put to the wayside to say, hey, you've heard stories about turning on coal plants back on in Germany and so forth. So they're real desperate for this type of product where if a liquefier can get certification or methane intensity and sell cargoes as lower carbon than not because they were sourced with low carbon natural gas. That's a big win and drives a big premium for folks. Along those lines, right? we're seeing deals start to be made, and I think the market hasn't maybe evolved quite as fast. Part of that probably has to do with Europe, but we're seeing utility companies start to strike deals with midstreamers and producers to buy certified natural gas at a premium to what's normal uncertified natural gas. And so upwards of a 5 maybe 7% premium is what we're seeing. Companies like Virginia Natural Gas and Xcel Energy have made conscious commitments to buying this type of natural gas for their systems. We've seen Tennessee Gas Pipelines strike a deal to basically transport and purchase exclusively low carbon natural gas, which I think is really interesting, right? Because if you think about certification being produced at the wellhead and at the production facilities, ultimately it's commingled with natural gas from others in the pipeline. And so I think that this is a really interesting development where now you have a pipeline that is dedicated to encouraging producers that are producing certified low carbon natural gas to use that pipeline. And it kind of brings that whole process full circle along the value chain. And then obviously regulatory frameworks are really driving, forcing operators to be conscious about, leak detection and methane mitigation, most notably the SEC disclosures for publicly traded companies having to disclose their scope 1, scope 2, and possibly scope 3 emissions. And then the EPA Quad B and C revisions that will soon become effective, which are far more strict than relative to the Quad A regulation. I think the regulation piece kind of creates an interesting conversation in this world of low emission natural gas, because does regulation undermine that low carbon natural gas premium, right? Because I think companies have seen this as an opportunity to differentiate their production and their products, but really it's being asked by regulators to be the standard. And so if it's the standard and everyone's expected to be producing at a low methane intensity, a low leak rate, is there really any differentiation left? So it'll be interesting to see how the regulation piece affects the demand and the market for low carbon natural gas as the years ahead materialize. And also, but again, on the other hand, you have that cap and trade system and the desire for European markets to see a certified low emission cargo that's LNG that's been made by low emission natural gas. And so I think there's going to be some competing regulations in Europe and the US that really drive some interesting market dynamics for whether or not ultimately producers can achieve the premium on this product that they think they can. One other thing on measurement that I wanted to touch on, because measurement is really paramount in this, and producers that are looking to align with a framework like OGMP 2.0 or a certification program like MIQ or both, you have to really consider your measurement strategy right, because the certification of your production really hinges on how well you're monitoring your facilities. And so, when it comes to measurement, you've got sensors, right? So different types of sensors like hyperspectral cameras, trace gas analyzers. You've got low cost sniffers, fence line monitoring technologies, and they're deployed in different ways, right? So the hyperspectral cameras you might see on a Bridger photonics plane doing flyover. There's some really cool technology with putting OGI cameras on a pad and watching them 24/7, 365. But paramount to a lot of these are the analytics. So you've got the sensor and you've got the deployment, and that data is essentially fed into a model. And so how well does that model detect leaks? How well does it quantify the leak? What are some other variables that are going into these analytic models that are used to help quantify some of the leaks? And it's interesting, and this was a slide that was shared by Dan Zimmerly about a year ago. So Dan runs the METEC facility at Colorado State in Fort Collins. And that's where they do a lot of testing of methane detection, emerging methane detection technologies. And this was just a toy example. This isn't like a real example, but it's more of a thought experiment. But I think it speaks to some of the difficulties and the strategies that operators need to consider when thinking about effective measurement programs for these purposes. And so, if you think about a continuous monitor that sits on a site, all day, every day, and it takes 4 hours to collect the data and analyze it, it's got a 20% probability of detecting a certain size leak, and it operates 24 hours a day. Like I said, it's fixed. With a 90% probability of detection, it would take 44 hours to see a leak. If it operated only during daylight hours, so say 8 hours a day, it'd be 124 hours to find a given leak. Compare that to a traditional OGI inspection where someone has a camera and they're doing a physical walk down of a site once every 30 days with a 99% probability of the leak. So you're pretty much guaranteed, you come once every 30 days, but you're guaranteed you're going to find the leak, basically. You still have a 360-hour window that leak could go unnoticed. So it's just an interesting thought experiment when you think of some of these technologies that might have a lower probability of detection for leaks than, say, traditional OGI, but it's there watching your site 24/7, 365. How does that factor into your math when you're thinking about how you're going to measure your methane emissions regularly across all of your production? So it's a really interesting question of scaling and strategy that I think producers are consciously and actively thinking about when it comes to this topic. So with that, I'll wrap up here by just saying that obviously I think we all know that natural gas promises to be a relevant low carbon energy for decades to come, and we have to do something about the associated methane emissions across the value chain in order for it to truly be low carbon or low emission fuel source. These third-party programs that have been developed, aim to accelerate those emissions reduction and regulatory compliance goals, but you've got to give it careful consideration when determining best fit for your organization. While interest in low carbon natural gas remains high, or low emission natural gas remains high, opposing market forces have been limited. or limited the demand and reduced the ROI on some of these certification programs that can be costly. And obviously measurement and reporting, as I've said throughout, continue to be paramount to ensuring the viability and credibility of the program that you're actively engaged in as an organization. With that, I appreciate you tuning in to listen to this talk at the CarbonExpo. Again, thanks to Dwayne and his team for putting together an absolutely awesome show. So happy to be back. So much has evolved in this space. Last year when I gave this talk, it seemed like this was just starting to get momentum in the mainstream oil and gas community. Now it definitely is mainstream, and as with any new and emerging area, lots of engaging conversations on this topic currently being had. And hopefully we'll be back here next year with an even more definitive look at the evolution of this topic. So enjoy the rest of your day and take care.